The house smelled like lemon polish and artificial calm. It had been 3 weeks since Evelyn Carter moved into her son's home in the suburbs of Boise. The rooms were neat, modern, and silent, too silent, in fact. No creaking floorboards. No rustling pines against the windows. Just the gentle hum of Charlotte's air purifier and the occasional clink of wine glasses being set down a bit too precisely. Every morning, Evelyn woke up early, as she always had. Back in the cabin, it had been the chill that got her up, time to stoke the fire, get the kettle going, feed the chickens if snow hadn't buried their coop. Here, it was habit more than need. The thermostat was timed. The kettle electric. The silence thick. She would tiptoe downstairs, hoping to get a head start on breakfast. But the kitchen was off limits. Charlotte made that clear, not rudely, just firmly. "Oh, you don't need to cook, Mom," she'd said with a rehearsed smile one morning. "Let me take care of it. Why don't you sit and rest? Read a book." So Evelyn sat and watched Charlotte bustle around in yoga pants and a tight ponytail, moving from fridge to counter like she was performing a solo ballet she had no intention of sharing. Evelyn had always believed in earning her place, in her marriage, in motherhood, in community. But here, the only job left was to not be in the way. She tried other things. Folding laundry, dusting baseboards, watering plants Charlotte had already watered. Once, she loaded the dishwasher and placed the forks tines down. Charlotte redid it an hour later. That night at dinner, Jack told her gently, "Mom, just let Charlotte handle that stuff. She's got a system." Evelyn said nothing, but she noticed how Jack didn't look at her when he said it. One afternoon, while Charlotte was out getting her hair done and Jack worked upstairs, Evelyn wandered into the living room and picked up a photo from the mantel. It was of Jack, much younger, sitting in Caleb's lap on a canoe, both grinning in the summer sun. Caleb's arm was tanned, muscular. Jack's cheeks flushed with joy. "I remember that day," she whispered, tracing the frame. "We forgot the fishing rods and ended up paddling just to hear the frogs." She smiled. Behind her, Jack cleared his throat. "Everything okay, Mom?" Evelyn startled, a little embarrassed to be caught in that moment. "Yes," she said, setting the photo down. "Just remembering." He nodded but didn't come closer. "Dinner'll be in an hour." It struck her that he hadn't asked what she was remembering. That Sunday, Charlotte made grilled chicken with rosemary and a wild rice salad. The table was set immaculately, down to linen napkins folded into perfect triangles. Their teenage son scrolled on his phone under the table. Their daughter asked if they could eat in front of the TV. "No," Charlotte said with finality. "We're eating as a family tonight." Evelyn sat quietly, hands folded. "Smells lovely," she said. "Reminds me of a stew Caleb used to make in the winters." Charlotte blinked. "Oh, that's nice." There was no invitation to continue. Jack talked about his job, something about a difficult client. Charlotte added in a story about the Pilates instructor who got engaged. No one asked Evelyn about her day. No one mentioned the quilt she had mended or the old journal she found while unpacking. So she sat, spooning salad onto her plate, chewing slowly. Then came the moment. Jack reached for the last roll. Evelyn, without thinking, reached at the same time. Their hands bumped. "Oh," Evelyn said, retracting quickly. Charlotte chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mom, you really don't have to lift a finger here. Honestly, we worry sometimes you'll hurt yourself." "I'm fine," Evelyn replied gently. "I've always kept busy." Jack gave her a tight smile. "Yeah, but it's different now." "I mean," he hesitated. Then he said it. "You wouldn't last a week out there, Mom. You can't even lift a grocery bag." The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. Evelyn's fork froze halfway to her mouth. She looked at Jack. Her son. The boy she had raised on her own for 5 years before Caleb entered their lives. The boy who used to climb onto her lap and say he wanted to live in the forest forever. And now he sat, biting into a dinner roll, not even realizing what he had done. Charlotte didn't flinch. If anything, she smiled, as if vindicated. Evelyn placed her fork down with care. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply disappeared inside herself, the way snow slowly covers the earth, soft, quiet, complete. That night, Evelyn sat alone in the guest bedroom. The walls were painted pale blue, the kind of color chosen by people who read too many catalogs. It was beautiful but soulless, like everything else in the house. She pulled open her suitcase. At the bottom, beneath folded flannel shirts and thermal socks, was a photograph. She took it out. It was her and Caleb, taken the day they finished building the cabin. He was shirtless, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag. She stood beside him, holding a hammer like a trophy. Behind them, the mountains stretched wide and proud. That night, they slept on the floor of the cabin. No mattress, just sleeping bags and the crackle of fire. Caleb had whispered, "We don't need much. Just this roof, this land, and each other." She held the photo close. "I miss you," she said to the walls. "I miss feeling like I belonged somewhere." Then, in the silence that followed, Evelyn realized something. She hadn't just lost her husband. She had lost her place. Not just in this house, but in the world these people had built, where elders were decorative, not essential. Where independence was inconvenient, and where love was measured by usefulness. The next morning, Evelyn rose before dawn. She moved slower now, but with purpose. She made herself tea. Not with Charlotte's glass teapot, but with her own old kettle, battered, loud, familiar. She sat by the kitchen window, watching the light turn the clouds pink. The house was still asleep. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was waiting for someone to permit her presence. She belonged to herself. She looked down at her hands, veined, strong, scarred by years of work. These hands had raised children, buried a husband, split wood, stitched buttons, planted potatoes, and written bedtime stories. And if they trembled a little now, they still worked. Later that day, while Charlotte was fussing over a new batch of scented candles and Jack was out mowing the lawn, Evelyn went to the garage. She opened the storage cabinet where they had tossed her things, like old decorations you weren't ready to throw out, but couldn't find a place for. She found her boots. She dusted them off, laced them tightly. And quietly, like snow melting at the edge of spring, she began to plan her return. Not just to a cabin, but to herself. It was 4:37 a.m. when Evelyn Carter laced up her boots in the dark. The house was still. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of a kitchen clock marked time. Outside, snow flurried against the windows in lazy spirals, dancing in the glow of a single porch light. She moved quietly, out of habit, not guilt. Her small duffel bag sat by the door, zipped and ready. Inside were only the essentials. Her old leather-bound recipe journal, the one passed down from her mother and filled with pages worn soft from use, Caleb's hunting knife, still sharp after all these years, a thermal sleeping bag, and a couple flannel shirts that still smelled faintly of pine wood and wood smoke. She reached for the last item, a photograph of her and Caleb, taken in the early days, both of them younger, wide-eyed, standing in front of their cabin with frost clinging to their hair and fire in their eyes. She didn't leave a note. She'd said everything that needed saying with her silence over the last few weeks. As the first blue threads of dawn unfurled on the horizon, Evelyn slipped out the door and closed it behind her without a sound. The air bit at her cheeks, but it felt good. Honest. She stood for a moment on the porch, taking one last look at the house that had never quite become a home. Then she walked away. The bus terminal was nearly empty, save for the man behind the counter and a sleepy couple arguing in whispers. Evelyn bought her ticket in cash and declined the offer to check her bag. She sat by the window as the bus pulled out of Boise and began its slow, winding journey north. The farther they drove, the more the scenery began to change. Rows of cookie-cutter homes and coffee shops gave way to towering evergreens and empty highways lined with frost. It felt like she was slowly exhaling a breath she didn't know she'd been holding for years. By the time she reached the closest town to the mountains, it was nearly noon. Evelyn stepped off the bus, her knees stiff but determined. The rest of the journey would be on foot. The forest path was barely visible beneath the fresh blanket of snow, but her feet knew the way. This was muscle memory, like knitting or baking bread. She walked slowly but steadily, one step, then another, through the trees that had once been her closest neighbors. Birdsong echoed through the pines, and snow crunched beneath her boots in rhythmic solitude. There were no voices, no judgment, no Charlotte asking her to sit down, no Jack reminding her not to lift heavy things. Just the wilderness, unforgiving, unfiltered, and free. It took her over an hour to reach the edge of the clearing. When the cabin came into view, she stopped. It was still there, a little more bowed than she remembered, its roof sagging under the weight of snow and time, but still standing. The windows were fogged over, shutters askew, but the chimney remained, silent, waiting. She crossed the clearing with slow reverence, as if approaching a sacred place. Pushing open the creaky door, Evelyn stepped into the cold, stale air of memory. Dust clung to every surface. The bed was covered with a heavy canvas sheet. The hearth was black with soot, and a family of spiders had taken residence in the corner. But to Evelyn, it was the most beautiful thing she'd seen in years. She dropped her bag by the door and walked to the center of the room. She closed her eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of cedar and ash and thyme. She whispered, "I'm home." The first few hours were spent reviving the cabin. She opened the windows briefly, letting the cold rush in and the past seep out. She swept the floor with an old broom she found behind the stove. She dusted off the rocking chair Caleb had built with his bare hands. She shook out the old wool blankets and draped them over the bed. Then she turned her attention to the hearth. It took time, chopping small kindling with shaky fingers, arranging the logs just so, striking the match until it caught. But when the flame finally flickered to life and curled into a steady glow, Evelyn sat back on her heels and watched, mesmerized. The warmth spread slowly through the room, like forgiveness. That evening, she sat beside the fire, a cup of tea cradled in her hands, and opened the recipe journal. The pages were yellowed and dog-eared, filled with notes in the margins and stains that told stories of meals long past. She flipped to a recipe for venison stew, and her eyes caught a faded scrawl from Caleb at the bottom of the page. "Don't forget the time. You always forget the time." She chuckled softly, the sound bouncing off the log walls like an echo from the past. And just like that, without warning, the memory returned, vivid and whole. It had been late autumn, 35 years ago. Caleb had come home with a fresh deer, and she'd been halfway through prepping the stew when she realized they were out of time. She'd cursed under her breath, and Caleb, still wearing his hunting boots, had laughed and said, "You'd forget your head if I didn't keep it screwed on." They ended up using crushed pine needles instead. "It's mountain time," he'd said, grinning. That night, they ate on the floor in front of the fire. Their daughter, barely 10, played with sticks outside. Snow had just started falling. Evelyn had leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder and whispered, "I never want to leave here." "You won't have to," he'd answered, "as long as I'm breathing." Now, decades later, Evelyn stared into the fire. "I stayed," she murmured, "even after you stopped breathing." There were tears, but they were warm, cleansing. Not the kind that broke you, but the kind that reassembled. She stayed there late into the night, rocking slowly, watching the flames curl upward like prayers. No one told her she was being too quiet. No one asked her what time dinner would be ready. No one looked at her with polite pity. She was alone, yes, but she was also herself, and that, she realized, was not loneliness. It was liberation. By midnight, the fire had turned to embers. Evelyn added one last log, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The stars blanketed the sky in silence. She stood barefoot in the snow for a moment, grounding herself, remembering every ache, every insult left unsaid, every moment she'd been made to feel less. Then she tilted her head back, looked at the universe, and whispered, "I am not less." And the wind, gentle and cool, carried her truth through the trees. The wind bit harder than usual that morning, slicing through the wool of Evelyn's coat as she stepped off the town bus. The clouds hung low, a bruised gray pressing down on the sleepy streets of Hayden's Hollow, the nearest town to her cabin. The kind of place where everyone still knew your first name but forgot to ask how you were doing. She pulled her scarf up tighter around her neck and clutched her purse close. The old leather handle had frayed at the seams, much like everything else she'd carried from her past life. The bank sat at the end of Main Street, A squat red brick building with glass doors that hissed as they opened. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed, and the faint scent of copier ink and stale coffee lingered in the air. A young man at the front desk offered her a practiced smile. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "Yes," Evelyn replied, trying to sound as composed as possible. "I'd like to withdraw some funds from my joint account. Evelyn and Caleb Carter." The man typed something into his computer. "Of course. May I see your ID?" She slid it over, waiting patiently. The pause. Then his brow furrowed. "I'm sorry," he said. "This account's been flagged. Restricted access." "Restricted?" Evelyn blinked. "What do you mean restricted?" "There's a legal power of attorney on file. It looks like," he squinted at the screen, "Jack Carter has been granted authority." "That's your son?" Evelyn's mouth went dry. "What kind of authority?" "He's listed as the primary on financial decisions. It says here the changes were filed 6 months ago." She could barely process the words. 6 months ago, she was still learning how to live without Caleb. 6 months ago, she had trusted her son completely. "I didn't sign anything," she said, her voice thin. The teller looked nervous now. "It was filed through a durable power of attorney form. It's possible it was signed on your behalf if he had legal documentation. You'd have to speak with our legal office." Evelyn stepped back from the counter, the walls closing in. The warmth of the room no longer reached her skin. She gathered her ID with shaking hands and walked out into the cold. Back on the sidewalk, she wandered. Her thoughts were jagged, disconnected, as if someone had poured ink across the carefully written pages of her life. She ended up outside the post office. An old bulletin board hung by the door, advertising farm equipment, babysitting services, and a flyer for a luxury assisted living facility in Boise. Evelyn paused. She didn't know why, but something about the picture, the sterile smiling faces, the photo of a woman about her age being helped into a rocking chair, filled her with a sense of unease. She opened her mailbox. Inside was a single cream-colored envelope. It was from the Willow Pines senior residence. She tore it open on the spot. "Dear Mrs. Carter, we are pleased to confirm your pre-approved placement at our facility. As per instructions from your family's legal guardian, your private suite has been reserved and will be available for occupancy starting next month. We look forward to welcoming you home." Evelyn read the letter twice. Then a third time. Her fingers curled into fists. She hadn't signed up for this. She hadn't agreed to any of it. She hadn't even been asked. They were planning to move her. To institutionalize her. To make her disappear into padded chairs and bingo schedules, without ever having the decency to speak to her face to face. And Jekchik, her only child, had signed the forms. She made it back to the cabin before sundown, her boots heavy with slush and betrayal. Inside, the fire had long since died. She didn't light it. Not right away. Instead, she sat at the edge of her cot, clutching the letter from Willow Pines and the bank slip in one hand, Caleb's old flannel blanket in the other. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Evelyn cried. Not quiet, ladle-like tears, the kind she had practiced in bathrooms and behind teacups. These were full-bodied sobs, ripped from somewhere deep and old, a place where loss and rage met, where sorrow turned to salt. She cried for the son who had once built tree houses with her in the summer sun. She cried for the woman she used to be, strong, needed, valued. And she cried for the terrible truth. They didn't see her anymore. Not as a mother. Not as a person. Not as someone who deserved a say in her own damn life. By midnight, the tears had dried. Her heart was hollow, but inside that emptiness, something began to stir. Not resentment. Not vengeance. But resolve. She stood slowly, knees aching, and made her way to the old dresser. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a manila envelope. Inside was the original deed to the land, signed decades ago by her and Caleb, in blue ink, smudged in the corner from where she'd spilled tea on it in 1987. She sat at the table, opened Caleb's old fountain pen, and began writing. The next morning, she walked to the ranger station 5 miles east, where a solar-powered fax machine sat waiting. The ranger on duty offered her coffee and didn't ask too many questions. Just nodded when she said, I need to send something urgent to a lawyer in Missoula. By noon, her request had been received. By Friday, it was approved. The cabin, and all 4 acres of surrounding forest, were now solely in her name. No Charlotte. No one else. Just her. That evening, Evelyn lit the fireplace again. She made herself stew and spooned it carefully into an old ceramic bowl. She poured tea, the kind her mother used to drink, black with a little honey, and sat at the table. On the wooden wall beside her, she pinned up 2 things. The letter from Willow Pines. The deed with her name written boldly at the top. She stared at them both. One was a cage. The other, the key. She folded her hands and whispered to the room, "They tried to take my life from me while I was still alive." The fire crackled. "But I'm still here." She didn't tell them what she had done. Not yet. She would in time. But for now, she let the silence wrap around her, not as isolation, but as protection. As clarity. They had planned a future for her without asking. But Evelyn had just written a different one, with her own name on the title page. And this time, no one was going to take it away. The knock on the door came just after 9 a.m. on a bright, bitter Saturday morning. Not the kind of knock that hesitated or asked permission, but one that announced a boundary had been crossed and someone had returned to claim what was left of themselves. Charlotte opened the door. Her carefully curled hair was pinned back, and she wore a beige cashmere robe tied perfectly at the waist. The faint scent of citrus and morning coffee drifted from inside. Behind her, the house looked exactly the same, neat, symmetrical, curated, as if chaos and love had no place there. Charlotte froze. Evelyn. Evelyn Carter stood on the porch in her old wool coat, a leather satchel slung across one shoulder, snow clinging to the hem of her boots. Her face gave away nothing. "I need a moment with you and Jack," she said evenly. "Now." Charlotte blinked. "Of course," she said automatically, stepping back. Evelyn entered the house, not as a guest, not as a mother, not as someone seeking warmth, but as a woman delivering her own verdict. Her boots thudded against the hardwood floor, echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. Jack appeared from the hallway, his sweater half-tucked, eyes still puffy from sleep. "Mom?" he said, brows knitting. "I won't stay long," she replied, setting the satchel on the dining table like it contained no less than the truth. From inside, she pulled out a large envelope, cream-colored, sealed neatly. "This," she said, sliding it forward, "belongs to both of you." Jack hesitated, reaching for it with the same nervousness one might reach for an old wound. He opened it slowly. Charlotte leaned in. Inside were 3 things. Legal documents proving Evelyn had reclaimed sole ownership of the cabin and surrounding property. Evidence from the bank showing Jack's power of attorney filed without her knowledge. And a small, folded piece of lined paper, torn from Evelyn's recipe journal. Charlotte unfolded it first, her mouth tightening as she read aloud in a whisper. "I may be your mother, but I am not your burden. I am not your problem to solve." Jack sat down slowly. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. Evelyn stood there, tall, steady, dignified, not waiting for explanation or apology. She was no longer the woman sitting quietly at their table, folding laundry no one thanked her for, or watering plants already wet. She was not furniture. She was not fragile. And she was done being silent. "I trusted you," she said to Jack, her voice quiet but unshaking. He opened his mouth. Closed it again. "You filled out legal forms in my name. You tried to put me in a home like I was furniture to be placed somewhere out of sight. And you didn't even have the decency to tell me." Jack looked at her, guilt painting his face in splotches. "I thought I was protecting you. You've been through so much. Dad's gone. You seemed weak." Evelyn offered. "No, just tired," said. "And I thought maybe you'd be better in a place where they could. Keep me busy? Keep me quiet." His eyes dropped. Charlotte crossed her arms. "Evelyn, no one wanted to hurt you. We were just trying to manage a difficult situation. You were grieving and alone in the woods." Jack was worried. "Don't," Evelyn interrupted. "Don't put this on grief or worry. Let's call it what it is, control." The word hung in the air, taut as a bowstring. You thought my silence meant surrender, she continued. You thought because I didn't complain, I'd accept anything. But I was listening. Every little sigh, every closed door, every unspoken decision made about me, but never with me. Charlotte looked away. I buried my husband with these hands, Evelyn said, lifting them, calloused and strong. I built a home with him. I split wood in blizzards. I've delivered babies in the dead of night as a volunteer nurse. And you tried to put me in a recliner with puzzle books and call it kindness. Jack's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. I didn't know how else to help you. Evelyn's eyes softened for just a second. Then you should have asked. He looked up. Would you have said yes? No, she said plainly. But I would have answered with my own voice. That's what matters. She stepped back from the table. I came here not to argue, not to shame you, she said. I came to reclaim what was mine. Not the land, but my name, my decisions, my story. I don't belong to you. I never did. I raised you so you could walk forward, not so you could dictate where I sit. Jack stood slowly, tears welling. What happens now? Evelyn looked at him, not with anger, but with the aching honesty of a mother who had expected more and been given less. Now, you live with your choices, she said. And I go home. She turned toward the door. No one tried to stop her. Charlotte whispered something, maybe, I'm sorry, or maybe just, goodbye, but Evelyn didn't pause. The words weren't earned yet. At the threshold, she looked back for only a moment. And in that breath, she saw them both, not as villains, not even as children, but as people who had let fear right over love. People who had traded compassion for convenience. She gave them one final gift. Her silence. Then she stepped out into the cold. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, fine and weightless. It dusted her shoulders like memory. She didn't cry. She didn't falter. She walked down the path, past the garden Charlotte never let her plant in, past the wind chimes she was told made too much noise, past the house where she had once hoped to grow old with dignity. As she rounded the corner, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her gloves. Inside one glove was a folded note, Caleb's handwriting, faded but still clear. If they ever forget who you are, go back to the trees. They remember everything. Evelyn smiled, just barely. She was going back. Not to escape. Not to punish. But to be seen again, by herself, and by the sky above her, and by the wind in the trees that still whispered her name without question. She had closed the door that was never truly open. And now she was walking through one that had always been waiting. The morning she returned to the cabin for good, Evelyn Carter stood on the front porch with her arms crossed and her heart wide open. The winter snow had finally begun to recede, revealing patches of earth beneath the melting white, a soft, reluctant surrender from the mountain. It had been weeks since she left her son's house. Weeks since she stood in that pristine living room and watched Jack and Charlotte shrink under the weight of her words. Weeks since she handed them that envelope and reclaimed not just the deed to this land, but her dignity. But standing there now, in the clear cold morning, Evelyn didn't think about them. She thought about what came next. The cabin had stood strong through another season, stubborn as she was. Its logs were weathered, its roof patched with tar and nailed tin, but its bones held steady. She ran a hand along the doorway, fingers brushing a spot Caleb had carved initials into decades ago. C+E, 1979. Still here, she whispered. And with that, Evelyn picked up her tool belt and got to work. She started small. A new coat of paint for the front door, forest green, like the needles of the pines surrounding them. Then came insulation, hammered between the logs with aching hands and determined shoulders. She repaired the old wood stove, fixed the squeaky hinges, and sealed the windows. And when the basics were done, she moved to something more sacred, building a space not just to live, but to welcome. Evelyn converted the old pantry into a second bedroom, installing a bunk bed she'd ordered from a carpenter in town. She cleared a space near the hearth for extra firewood and stacked it neatly, each log a promise of warmth to come. She embroidered a curtain from leftover quilt squares, hanging it between the kitchen and sleeping area to create a sense of privacy and peace. There were no blueprints, no permits, only memory, intuition, and love. She called it the Hearth House. Not a shelter, not a center, just a place with a bed, a stove, and someone who listened. There was no sign out front, no brochure, just word of mouth and the understanding that when life pushed a woman too far, she could walk through Evelyn Carter's door and not be judged for the limp in her step or the silence in her eyes. The first guest came in early April. Her name was June, a retired school librarian who had been quietly evicted from her daughter's guest house when her grandchildren needed the room for online classes. Evelyn found her sitting at the post office bench, holding a cardboard suitcase and a blank stare. "I'm not homeless," June said, as if defending herself from some invisible verdict. "I just didn't fit anymore." Evelyn sat beside her. "I've got a kettle that whistles and a rocking chair that creaks. That's about all I can offer." June looked at her, blinking. "But if that's enough," Evelyn added, "you're welcome to it." June came and stayed for 4 weeks. She read old books from Evelyn's shelf and helped mend curtains and boil sap for syrup. On her last day, she left a note tucked under the sugar jar. "You didn't give me a place to stay. You gave me a place to still exist. Thank you." Word spread, softly, like good news shared in whispers. A woman named Nina came next, fleeing a son who said he couldn't care for her and his startup too. Then Gloria, who had lived most of her life taking care of her brother with dementia, only to be forgotten once he passed. Evelyn never asked for stories, but they told them anyway. At night, around the fire, between spoonfuls of stew and shared slices of quiet, they remembered who they had once been: nurses, bakers, farmers, teachers, mothers, midwives, dreamers, and who they still were beneath the labels of burden or too much trouble. One evening in late spring, Evelyn stepped outside just as the sun was bleeding into the mountains. 3 women sat on the porch. June had returned for a visit, Gloria was humming an old folk tune, and Nina was darning socks in the rocker. The kettle whistled behind her, but Evelyn didn't move. She watched them, these women who had come broken, bruised, or just quietly abandoned. Now they laughed about things like soup recipes and thunder patterns. They moved slower, spoke softer, but they were here, alive, free. A memory surfaced as Evelyn stood there, an old one, long buried. She and Caleb on the night their daughter was born. There had been a storm, and the power went out just as the baby's first cry filled the cabin. Evelyn was still shaking, wrapped in flannel, and Caleb had cradled their daughter near the fire. "We'll call her Layla," he said, "because it means night." And she arrived when the world was darkest, but she brought the light. Evelyn had nodded, exhausted and aching and so full of love. "We'll keep her safe," she had whispered. And for a long time, they did. Until the world changed. Until people forgot how to keep their elders safe. Until safety became synonymous with silence, and care became a transaction. But not here. Not at the Hearth House. Here, Evelyn thought, we still remember what warmth means. Later that night, as everyone drifted off to sleep and the fire crackled low, Evelyn sat with her journal. She wrote slowly, fingers sore but steady. This is not a rebellion. This is not revenge. This is a reminder that we are still here. That women over 60 don't vanish, they simmer. That we are not furniture to be rearranged. We are the flame. We are the hearth. She closed the book. Outside, the wind howled faintly through the trees, but inside, the cabin stood warm, alive, and full of breath. No longer a hiding place. Now a beacon. Evelyn Carter no longer measured her days in hours or meals or seasons. She measured them in stories. Not the kind found in books, but the kind passed over hot mugs of tea and shared glances between women who had forgotten how it felt to be seen. The kind spoken in half-whispers before bed, or while folding fresh laundry, or kneading dough with trembling but determined fingers. At 70 now, Evelyn didn't consider herself old. She considered herself reborn. The Hearth House had changed her, but not in the loud, cinematic kind of way. There were no trophies on the mantel. No front-page newspaper stories. Only the subtle kind of transformation that settles deep in the chest. The kind that reshapes your spine, slowly, until you're standing taller than you ever thought possible again. Each morning, she rose before the sun. The cabin, quiet and chilled from the night, stirred as she lit the wood stove and brewed strong black tea. She'd open the windows for just a moment to let the mountain air breathe through the rooms, like a baptism of fresh beginnings. Then came her daily rituals. She'd flip through her leather journal, now nearly full, marking tasks in her small, neat handwriting. Fold clean linens. Slice apples for pie. Fix latch on pantry door. Journal entry, first frost. Would stack holding up. Cabin full. There were no staff. No schedule. Just Evelyn. And whoever found their way to her door that week. Some days she was alone, and the silence was a balm. But most days someone was there. One Tuesday in late October, two women arrived within hours of each other. The first was Clara, 64, who had left a suburban home after her daughter-in-law began labeling everything she touched with sticky notes that read, "Not yours." "I kept my mouth shut for 3 years," Clara said, sipping her tea. "Then one day, I opened the fridge and saw a note on a jar of pickles. 'Not yours.' I took it as a sign." Evelyn chuckled. "I would have taken the pickles." Later that same day came Ruth, 71, quiet and slow-moving. Her son had filled out paperwork at a memory care center before she'd even shown signs of confusion. "He said it was proactive," Ruth murmured. "I said it felt like exile." That night, the three women sat together around the old oak table, the fire warming their backs, the smell of cinnamon rising from the oven. No one cried. They laughed. They told stories. And Evelyn watched them, something swelling in her chest, a joy so grounded it felt like earth. The next day, Clara taught them how to braid sourdough loaves. Ruth knitted by the window, humming a tune Evelyn didn't recognize but somehow remembered. Later, they baked an apple pie. Evelyn had written the recipe herself years ago in her mother's handwriting, just to feel close to her. As she measured out the nutmeg, Clara asked, "Do you ever miss who you were before all this?" Evelyn paused, smiled. "No," she said. "I think I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be now." That night, Evelyn sat at the writing desk tucked in the corner of the cabin, an old cedar slab Caleb had built when they first moved in. She opened her journal and began to write. The world expects women to fade, to become useful only as memory keepers, or babysitters, or burdens. But here, in this small wooden house, we laugh louder than we ever did in our 20s. We teach each other things our children never thought to ask. We dance when no one's looking. This is not retirement. It's resistance. She signed, EC, Day 204 at Hearth House. The changes were not just within Evelyn. They were visible, too. Her back stood straighter now, her skin a little more sun-touched from chopping wood and walking along the ridge. She moved with the grace of someone who knew she mattered. There was a fire in her now, not fierce or loud, but constant. Steady. The kind that didn't beg to be noticed, but would never again be extinguished. Every woman who passed through the Hearth House left something behind. A quilt square. A loaf of rye bread with a note tucked inside. A story told in the hush of twilight. A photo tacked to the hallway. Clara, Ruth, June, Nina, Gloria, and more. A wall of soft rebellion, framed in toothy grins and wild gray hair. Sometimes Evelyn would sit in the rocking chair by the fire and stare at those photos, remembering their laughter, their scars, their strength. She never asked them to stay, but she always told them they could return. One afternoon, as snow began to fall outside, Evelyn made cocoa and placed 3 mugs on the table, hers, Clara's, Ruth's. She reached for the embroidered cloth on the mantel and smiled. "We are not past our prime. We are in a second bloom." And then, from the porch, came a knock. She opened the door to find a young woman, no more than 30, shivering in a denim jacket, a duffel at her feet, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Are you Evelyn?" she asked. "I am. Someone in town said you take people in. My grandma told me about a place once. I didn't know if it was real." Evelyn stepped aside. "It's real," she said. "And the kettle's on." That night, Evelyn sat on her porch alone after the others had gone to bed. The stars shimmered above, fierce and silent. She wrapped her shawl tighter and watched her breath curl into the cold. For a moment, she thought about the house in Boise. The way her daughter-in-law arranged the throw pillows like chess pieces. The way Jack said, "You wouldn't last a week out there." It had been 10 months. And she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. She closed her eyes and whispered into the night. Life doesn't end with age. Sometimes it just begins differently. And in the woods, where the pines stood tall and the wind carried stories, Evelyn Carter smiled, softly, fully, and without regret. She had found herself again. And this time, she wasn't going anywhere. The calls began in late spring. At first, Evelyn let the phone ring. She had no desire to revisit voices that once told her where she could live, how she should feel, or what her future should look like. But Jack was persistent. His voicemails weren't apologies. They were explanations, carefully worded attempts to soften a truth that Evelyn had already absorbed in full. Things like, "Mom, I didn't think you'd take it that way," or, "We were trying to do what's best." It wasn't personal. Each message landed like snow on already frozen ground, silent, cold, and quickly forgotten. Then came the letter. Charlotte's handwriting was still immaculate, like everything else about her. "Evelyn, we didn't realize how deeply you were affected. We didn't mean harm. We just didn't know what else to do. No, I'm sorry. No ownership. Just a tidy plea to erase the consequences of their choices." Evelyn placed the letter on the kitchen shelf, between her mother's cookbook and the wooden salt grinder Caleb had carved, and left it there. Weeks passed. The cabin was busy. The kettle boiled every morning. The bed sheets were changed often. New names were sewn into the quilt square in the hallway. Evelyn didn't have time to grieve what she had already grieved. And she didn't feel like explaining her piece to people who had mistaken her silence for permission. Until one day, Charlotte showed up. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the mountain air tasted like pine and smoke and slow forgiveness. Evelyn was outside, stacking firewood, when the crunch of tires on gravel pulled her attention toward the road. Charlotte's car was small and clean, just like always. She stepped out in flats unsuited for mud, her posture as tight as her cardigan. She looked out of place, and very alone. No flowers. No rehearsed speeches. Just Charlotte. And Evelyn, dust on her cheeks, axe in her hand, heart steady. They stared at one another for a long moment. Charlotte took a breath. "I didn't call because I didn't want to be told not to come." Evelyn set the axe down. "I wouldn't have," she said. Charlotte looked surprised. "You would have let me come?" "No," Evelyn answered plainly. "I just wouldn't have said anything at all." She didn't offer a hug. That wasn't the kind of reunion this was. But she opened the door to the cabin. Inside, the air smelled like lemon balm and cedarwood. A loaf of fresh bread cooled on the counter. Evelyn poured 2 mugs of tea and gestured toward the chair across from her at the old table. Charlotte sat, folding her hands as if preparing for a meeting. The silence stretched between them, not hostile, but thick with memory. Finally, Evelyn stood and took a small, leather-bound book from the shelf, the one she wrote in every day, just beneath her recipe journal. She placed it in front of Charlotte. "I want you to read this," she said, "before you say anything." Charlotte hesitated, then opened the journal. The pages were filled with Evelyn's neat script, peppered with dates, observations, and names of the women who had passed through the hearth house. But it wasn't a diary. It was a testament. To resilience. To grief. To love that had no room in glass homes and tight routines. Charlotte read quietly for almost an hour. Evelyn said nothing. She let her read, sip her tea, shift uncomfortably when she reached the parts that mirrored her own actions. There was an entry from the week Evelyn left their house. "I never wanted a fight. I wanted a place at the table. But when your seat becomes someone else's burden, it's no longer a place to sit, it's a place to disappear." Another from 2 months later. "Forgiveness, I'm learning, isn't something you offer others. It's something you give yourself so you can sleep at night without bitterness turning your dreams sour." Charlotte closed the journal gently and placed her hand on the cover. "I didn't know you were carrying so much," she whispered. Evelyn looked at her, her daughter-in-law, The woman she had once tried so hard to love, to please, to fit in with. You didn't ask. The sky outside had begun to turn. Blue melting into amber, shadows stretching across the floorboards. Charlotte rubbed her palms together. I came here because I need to ask you something. I don't know how to say it right, but say it wrong, Evelyn said. Just say it. Charlotte took a breath. Do you forgive me? Even if I never asked for it the right way? Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She sipped her tea, looked at the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but not fragile. I forgive you, she said, but not so you can feel better. Charlotte blinked. I forgive you, Evelyn repeated, so I can sleep. So I can keep pouring tea, keep baking bread, keep living. I forgive because bitterness doesn't suit me. But forgiveness doesn't mean return. It doesn't mean reset. It means I've closed a door. And I don't need to open it again to prove I've healed. Charlotte's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Not for show. Not for comfort. Just for truth. She stayed for dinner. They didn't talk about the past. They talked about the herbs growing outside, about a deer that came close to the porch that morning. Evelyn showed her a blanket someone had crocheted as a thank you gift. Charlotte admired the stitchwork. At one point, Charlotte asked if she could help wash the dishes. Evelyn nodded. Third drawer. Towels are in there. There was no grand reconciliation. No clasped hands across the table. Only two women. Drinking tea. Folding towels. Trying not to say too much, or say too little. As night fell, Charlotte stepped back onto the porch. The sky was glittered with stars. She looked at the cabin one last time. It's beautiful, she said. You made something beautiful. Evelyn didn't smile. But her eyes held a calm kind of pride. I made it because I needed to. That's the only reason beauty ever lasts. Charlotte opened her mouth to say something more, but closed it. She walked to her car. No hug. No promises. Just a quiet nod. Evelyn watched her drive away, the headlights disappearing behind the curve of the road. Then she turned back inside, closed the door, and added one more line to her journal. She came. She saw. And maybe she'll finally start listening. Then she placed the journal back on the shelf and turned to stoke the fire. There was a photograph Evelyn kept near the window. It was old, sepia-toned and slightly curled at the edges. In it, she stood next to her mother, both of them dressed in heavy coats, holding mason jars filled with peach preserves. They were laughing. Their cheeks were flushed red from the cold, their smiles unposed and alive. She must have been 15. Her mother had just finished telling her, if the world ever tells you you're too much, too loud, too old, come home and make jam. The people who love you won't care what you do. They'll care that you're still here. Evelyn had carried that memory all her life. But it wasn't until she reached her late 60s, until her husband had passed, until her son tried to move her out of her own story, that she finally understood what it meant. For most of her adulthood, Evelyn believed her worth was tied to her usefulness. The meals she cooked, the diapers she changed, the calendars she remembered for everyone else. She held the holidays together. She packed lunchboxes and ironed shirts and filled silences when others didn't know how. She stayed busy, because busy meant needed. And needed meant valued. But something shifted when she moved into her son's house. There, her helpfulness became a nuisance. Her wisdom became outdated. Her presence, a soft reminder of age, of mortality, of things people didn't want to think about. They didn't tell her to leave. They just made it clear she didn't belong. And for a moment, just a moment, Evelyn began to believe them. Until the day she looked at that old photo again. And she remembered. Her mother had never been anyone's burden. She had also never been anyone's assistant. She was her own person. She laughed when she wanted. She cried when she needed. She took up space and never apologized for it. And now, decades later, Evelyn realized she didn't have to shrink to stay. She didn't have to be productive, impressive, or helpful to exist with dignity. That's what the Hearth House taught her. That the value of a woman doesn't peak in her youth and decline with age, it deepens. That life after 60 isn't a slow fade. It's a new color, a different kind of beauty. A richness. a knowing. One night, after the others had gone to bed, Evelyn sat in front of the fire with her journal open. The flames danced quietly, casting soft gold light on the walls. She wrote, "They tried to reduce me to a role, mother, grandmother, widow. They forgot that I am also a woman, a mind, a soul, a whole, breathing, wanting, remembering, learning human being." She looked at the photo again, the one with her mother, the mason jars, the joy. And she whispered, "You don't have to be kept whole. You don't have to be needed to be worthy. You don't have to stay useful to stay real." Evelyn didn't just survive being cast aside. She rewrote what it meant to live again. She didn't rebuild her life out of bitterness. She built it out of memory, out of need, and out of a sacred truth. Backhand index pointing right, you don't need to be kept in order to exist. You only need to respect yourself enough to begin again. Somewhere outside, the wind rustled through the pines. Evelyn closed her eyes and let it pass over her like an embrace from the past, and a promise for tomorrow. She didn't know how many more winters she would see. But she knew this. She was not done. And she was not invisible. The first snow of the season came early that year. It whispered through the trees with no fanfare, just the slow descent of white over pine needles and rooftops, blanketing the old cabin like an old friend returning to rest. Inside, Evelyn Carter stirred the soup pot gently, the scent of rosemary and garlic rising with the steam. Behind her, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, throwing golden light across the wooden floor. Two women sat on the couch near the fire, Marla, 71, who had left a city apartment she couldn't afford, and Elise, 65, who had walked away from a life of quiet erasure. They weren't talking. They didn't need to. In the hearth house, silence wasn't awkward, it was safe. Evelyn was 70 now. And for the first time in her life, she felt ageless. Not young. Not old. Just steady, like the cabin, like the trees, like the fire that had never once gone out since she'd rekindled it that first winter after leaving her son's home. The days were full but never rushed. Some mornings she chopped wood until her arms ached. Others, she stayed in bed with a book and her tea. There were visitors most weeks, women with stories stitched into the lines around their eyes and the heaviness in their breath. They came and went without judgment. They stayed as long as they needed. Sometimes a night. Sometimes a season. And every time, they left a part of themselves behind. A note, a scarf, a favorite recipe, a laugh that lingered in the walls like perfume. Jack never visited. But twice a year he sent postcards. Once in spring with a photo of a wildflower field and the words, "Hope you're well, Mom. The kids are asking about you." Once at Christmas, with a drawing his daughter made, Evelyn's granddaughter, whom she hadn't seen in years. The messages were brief, careful. But she read them anyway. Then tucked them into a drawer with the others. Not out of bitterness, but out of understanding. Though she came. Not often. Maybe once every 2 months. She never called ahead. Just appeared with a soft knock, a paper bag of groceries, and that same guarded look in her eyes. She didn't try to fix anything anymore. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer apologies that were too late. She just sat. Sometimes for an hour. Sometimes for an entire afternoon. In the beginning, Charlotte's visits unsettled Evelyn, stirred a flicker of old pain. But in time, Evelyn began to recognize something else beneath the quiet, a different kind of love. One that no longer demanded. One that didn't push or apologize too loudly. Presence. Maybe it wasn't perfect. Maybe it was still learning. But it was real. And it was enough. On one such evening, Evelyn poured 2 mugs of tea and passed one to Charlotte without a word. The younger woman sat on the edge of the armchair, her hands wrapped around the mug like she was holding a fragile truth. They watched the fire in silence. Then Charlotte said, barely above a whisper, "I used to think you were hard to understand." Evelyn didn't respond. "But now," Charlotte added, "I think I was just never taught how to listen." Evelyn looked at her, not with anger, not with sadness, but with a quiet softness that came from years of letting go. "That's something we all have to learn eventually," she said. "How to listen without needing to fix." Charlotte nodded, tears glinting but never falling. After she left that night, Evelyn sat alone in her chair. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the fire kept the room warm. She pulled her journal into her lap, the same one she had been writing in for nearly 3 years now. Its cover was worn, the edges frayed. The pages held the weight of her journey, moments of grief, of joy, of quiet transformation. She turned to the last empty page. And she wrote, "Asterisk, they don't all come back. And that's okay. Love doesn't always look like the movies. Sometimes it looks like postcards in spring. Sometimes it looks like a paper bag on the doorstep. But me, I never needed to be rescued. I just needed to be remembered. I was never the burden. I was the hearth, warm and waiting. They just forgot where home was." She set down the pen, closed the journal, let the firelight brush across her face like a blessing. That night, Evelyn didn't dream of her past. She dreamed of the house alive with voices. Laughter in the kitchen. Music on the porch. Footsteps on the stairs. A quilt growing with new names. A pie cooling by the window. A woman placing her suitcase by the fire and breathing, for the first time in years, as if she had finally found a place to be whole again. She dreamed of a future where women didn't have to ask permission to exist. Where they were not shuffled aside once their usefulness had expired. Where they could become, fully, fearlessly, and without apology, who they had always been. When morning came, Evelyn lit the stove, brewed her tea, and watched the snow melt slowly from the roof. Another guest would arrive soon. She could feel it. And when they did, the door would open. The kettle would whistle. And the hearth, ever warm, ever waiting, would glow once more.